The vast expanse of space stretched out like a black sea, dotted with the bright lights of distant stars. The hum of the damaged Terran fleet was all that could be heard in the deep silence, the old ships creaking under the weight of their years. At the heart of it all, the rising dawn. A battleship that had seen more wars than most people could remember, hung in orbit above a dying planet, its hull scarred from years of combat. Inside, the crew was busy, moving with the practiced urgency of soldiers who had seen everything, yet knew the odds were against them. The war against the Threx Dominion had reached its breaking point. The coalition was losing, and nothing they had tried had been enough. Then the message came. Reinforcements incoming. Lieutenant Jax Harper squinted at the comm screen. His eyes narrowed in disbelief. Reinforcements. He had just finished watching the last few remaining warships of the Galactic Union retreat in the distance. Reinforcements didn't come from nowhere. The voice crackling over the speaker was too calm for his liking. "You're going to want to see this, Lieutenant. They're human. Human," Jax muttered, his hand gripping the edge of his console. The word felt wrong, out of place. His mind raced, searching for the logic behind the announcement. From where? From Earth. From, well, them, the officer replied, a tone of disbelief in his voice. Jax's heart sank. Earth had been reduced to a memory, its once glorious fleets now nothing but a collection of wreckage scattered across the galaxy. The Terrans were long gone from the front lines, their warriors nothing more than stories told around fires. But now, they were coming. "Bring them in," he ordered, trying to suppress the wild confusion rising within him. The ships entered view, a ragtag fleet of hulking, battered relics that seemed more suited for scrapyards than combat. Rusted hulls, faded paint, and mismatched weapon systems. The enemy would laugh. But Jax, he just stared. One ship in particular stood out, the Rising Thunder, a dreadnought with a history longer than most people's lives. Its cannons were enormous, but they looked more ceremonial than functional. The old symbol of Earth's forces was still painted on the side, faded and chipped, but unmistakable. "They're coming in hot, sir," one of the bridge officers called out. "Shields are not operational." Jax's eyes widened. Not operational. He looked down at the display, but the only thing moving on the radar was the Earth fleet. It was almost sad, almost too predictable. They were going to get torn apart before they even touched down. "They're just going to drift in?" Jax asked, his voice barely a whisper. The older officer beside him, Commander Thorne, grunted. "Guess they're hoping their reputation still has some weight." And then, with a sudden jolt that sent the entire ship shuddering, the Rising Thunder made its move. The old ship didn't turn gracefully. It didn't glide through the void with the precision of the newer, sleeker models. It lurched forward, the sound of its ancient engines roaring to life as it began firing at full blast. And that's when Jax saw it. The Rising Thunder wasn't retreating. It wasn't running. It was advancing. For a moment, Jax stood frozen in disbelief as the aging human ships surged forward, their weapons crackling to life. This wasn't the same humanity that had once been forced to the edge of the galaxy. No, this was something new, something desperate. And then, all at once, Jax realized. The Terrans weren't afraid of death. They had nothing left to lose. "Get ready," he said, the words coming out slow and steady. The old dogs might just have one last fight in them. And in that instant, as the fleet of elderly human ships prepared to face the Threx, Jax couldn't help but think that this battle might just be the turning point the galaxy had been waiting for. The Threx fleet was vast, an imposing armada with sleek, silver ships that gleamed under the light of the distant sun. Their weapons were cutting edge, their tactics flawless. But none of it mattered when they came up against the Terran veterans. On the command bridge of the Rising Dawn, Lieutenant Jax Harper stared out at the approaching battle. His mind raced, trying to piece together what was unfolding. The Terran reinforcements, old, battle-worn soldiers with decades of experience, had been given a single task: hold the line. But it was more than that. They weren't just holding a line. They were waiting. And Jax didn't understand why. The massive Threx ships approached, their engines glowing bright with menace. With a flick of a switch, the Threx captain launched the first salvo. Laser bolts streaked through space like fiery streaks of death, aimed directly at the human fleet. "Brace for impact," shouted Commander Thorne, but his voice was drowned out by the pounding sound of the barrage. But the humans didn't flinch. They didn't panic. They had seen this all before. The rising thunder's cannons roared, returning fire with a vengeance. Yet it wasn't the force of their weapons that would make a difference. It was their timing, their precision. Jax watched as the old Terran ships didn't scatter. They didn't follow the predictable patterns that most soldiers would have. Instead, the fleet formed an unbreakable wall, slow but steady, almost deceptively so. Their old engines groaned, pushing them forward at a crawl. Yet it was that crawl that made all the difference. "They're coming in too fast," one of the younger officers muttered, his fingers nervously tapping at his controls. "They're going to hit us head-on." But the humans weren't worried. At least they didn't seem to be. Suddenly, the older crew members of the Rising Dawn began to speak in calm, measured tones. "Activate the debris field," Colonel Dubois ordered, her voice like a quiet storm in the room. Her eyes, sharp, calculated, never left the view of the Threx ships. With the press of a button, the human fleet launched an entire cloud of old satellites and asteroids they had salvaged. The debris, jagged and irregular, filled the space in front of them like an uncharted maze. "What are they doing?" Jax asked, watching as the debris field expanded into the Threx path. "They're not fighting with firepower," Commander Thorne explained quietly. "They're fighting with time." The Threx didn't understand. They assumed the debris was a simple distraction, a move to confuse their sensors. But the Terrans knew something the Threx didn't. The old debris had been carefully programmed to disrupt their targeting systems, sending false readings and false signals to the Threx weapons. In that brief moment of chaos, the Threx ships slowed their advance, confused by the sudden anomaly. The Terrans were ready. They didn't need speed. They didn't need fancy tech. They simply needed to use the one advantage they had: their minds. In a flash, the rising thunder released a hail of missiles, not aimed directly at the Threx fleet, but at the blind spots left by the debris. It was an ambush, a tactic so old it hadn't been used in centuries. Yet it worked. The missiles found their targets, piercing through the enemy's defenses. Jax stood at the window, his heart pounding. The Threx fleet faltered, their sleek ships taking the hit and beginning to break apart under the sheer weight of the humans' clever tactics. They didn't react, Jax muttered, astonished. They didn't even know what was happening. "They still don't," Colonel Dubois replied with a thin smile, as her fingers glided across her controls, calling in more of the same strategy. "But they will." For the first time in what felt like years, the Terran fleet wasn't the underdog, it was the predator. And Jax had a feeling this would be the first of many surprises to come. The battlefield was a swirling chaos of debris and twisting ships. The Threx fleet had been thrown into disarray after the Terran ambush, but they weren't finished yet. Their leaders would never let a small setback stop them. They regrouped, recalculated, and launched a counterattack with ruthless precision. Lieutenant Jax Harper watched as the sleek Threx ships advanced, forming tight clusters and moving with a synchronized grace that spoke of years of training and perfect coordination. Their weapons hummed with power, charging up for another devastating assault. But the Terran ships, old, battered, and outgunned, didn't retreat. They didn't flinch. The Rising Dawn shifted into position, its crew working like a well-oiled machine, despite the old equipment and worn-out consoles. Every movement was deliberate, every calculation sharp. "You think they can hold?" Jax asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. He couldn't help but feel the weight of the odds stacked against them. The Threx were far superior in technology and numbers. Commander Thorne stood beside him, her expression unreadable as she watched the enemy fleet through the glass. They won't need to. Not yet. Jax's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Thorne didn't answer right away. Instead, she pressed a button on the console, and a map of the battlefield appeared. He watched as she tapped several spots, her fingers moving with practiced ease over the screen. I've seen this before, she said finally, her tone matter-of-fact. When you've fought as long as they have, you learn something the young ones can't grasp. She paused, her eyes locking onto the advancing Threx ships. You don't need to win all the time. You just need to make them think you can. Jax's stomach tightened as he realized what she meant. The Terrans weren't playing the game by the same rules as the Threx. They weren't focused on destroying their enemies head-on. They were focused on messing with their heads. And that's exactly what they did. The first shot came from the rising dawn, but it wasn't aimed at the Threx fleet directly. Instead, the Terran ship fired a pulse of electromagnetic energy, striking the edge of the debris field. The blast sent shockwaves rippling through the mess of asteroids, sending several of them tumbling in unpredictable directions. It was a brilliant move, creating new obstacles for the Threx ships to navigate, forcing them to adjust their course at the last second. And then, with a sudden burst of speed, the rising thunder appeared from behind the debris field, firing a barrage of missiles with deadly accuracy. The missiles didn't strike directly at the enemy. Instead, they exploded in the path of the Threx ships, sending shrapnel and radiation waves scattering through the battlefield. The Threx ships scattered in a frantic attempt to avoid the barrage, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Their tight formations were shattered, their precision disrupted. The Terrans had thrown their entire fleet into a mess of confusion, something the Threx weren't prepared for. Jax stared in disbelief as the Threx fleet began to splinter, their sleek ships now moving erratically. The young Threx officers at the helm of each ship cursed, their faces twisted in frustration as they tried to regain control. The Terran veterans, on the other hand, remained calm. They were playing the long game, always one step ahead. They weren't trying to outgun the Threx. They were outsmarting them. They're panicking, Jax muttered. The Threx are panicking. Commander Thorne gave a quiet chuckle. Exactly. The young ones laugh at us, thinking we're too old for this fight. They think we've lost our edge. Her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. But the truth is, we've never been sharper. It was a simple move, a move that the young officers in the Threx fleet couldn't have predicted. They had underestimated the Terrans, and now they were paying for it. The veterans didn't need speed, power, or cutting-edge technology. They had something far more dangerous: experience. And with each passing second, it became clear that the Terran fleet wasn't just surviving. They were winning. The silence between battles was the hardest part. It wasn't the blaring alarms or the hiss of the ship's metal as it groaned under pressure. It was the stillness, the waiting. The Terran fleet had scored a decisive victory, but the Threx weren't known for backing down so easily. Lieutenant Jax Harper stood at the command window, staring out at the debris field that had once been part of a massive Threx fleet. The shattered pieces of enemy ships drifted like broken dreams in the cold void, a testament to the raw cunning of the aging Terran forces. But the Threx would regroup. They would adapt. "Do you think they'll come for us again?" Jax asked, not expecting an answer. "Of course they will," came the steady reply from Commander Thorne, her voice barely a whisper. She stood beside him, her arms folded, watching the same sight with the cool detachment of someone who'd seen it all before. "They'll come faster this time. Harder." Jax turned to face her, his brow furrowed in frustration. "Then why are we sitting here? Why don't we press the advantage?" Thorne looked at him then, her gaze sharp but not unkind. "Because, Jax," she said slowly, "the Threx play by their own rules. And if we play by theirs, we lose." Jax didn't understand at first. The Threx were known for their brutal efficiency, Their ability to adapt to any situation. Why not use that against them? Why not force them to react? Instead of attacking them head-on, we need to make them attack us the way we want them to. Thorne continued, turning away from the window. She moved toward the central table, tapping a series of controls that brought up a holographic map of the sector. We use their strength against them. We make them fight on our terms. Jax's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Watch and learn, Thorne said with a small smile, tapping a few more commands. The hologram shimmered as the tactical display shifted, highlighting a small, seemingly insignificant moon in the sector. It was barely more than a rock, but that was exactly why it was the perfect spot. We're going to lure them in, Thorne explained. The Threx think they have superior firepower in numbers. And they're right. But they're not as clever as they think. Jax felt a growing sense of unease in his gut. You're going to make it look like we're retreating. Thorne nodded, her eyes gleaming with a dangerous light. Exactly. We'll fake a retreat, abandon our position, and lead them straight to the moon. And when they come in for the kill, we'll trap them. Jax's eyes widened as the full scale of her plan hit him. You want to use the moon as a weapon. We don't have much choice, Thorne said. If we fight them head-on again, we'll be wiped out. But if we can manipulate them into a mistake, we might just win. The trap was simple in theory. They would abandon their position, creating a false signal of retreat, and lead the Threx fleet into the narrow gravity well of the moon. There, the Threx would be forced to slow down, their ships unable to escape the moon's pull. It was a calculated risk, but if it worked, the Threx would be trapped in a dead zone with no way out. Jax shook his head, both impressed and horrified. And if it doesn't work? We won't let it fail, Thorne said, her voice cold and sure. We've lived long enough to know that sometimes the worst thing you can do is fight fair. It was a strategy that would turn everything the Threx believed about combat upside down. The Dominion relied on honor, on adhering to the rules of war. But the humans? They would do whatever it took to win. The Terran fleet set their plan into motion, abandoning the debris field and drifting toward the moon at a slow pace, making it look like their engines had failed. The Threx, sensing an easy victory, took the bait. But as they followed the humans' trajectory, they failed to see the trap closing in around them. On the bridge of the rising dawn, Jax held his breath. Thorne's plan was in motion. And now, there was no turning back. I hope this works, Jax muttered to himself. But Thorne didn't answer. She simply watched the Threx fleet approach, a quiet smile playing at the corner of her lips. It will, she said softly. It will. The cold darkness of space stretched out endlessly, but on the rising dawn, the atmosphere was charged with a tension that could be felt in every creak of the hull. Lieutenant Jax Harper stood near the command center, watching the approach of the Threx fleet on the tactical display. The Threx ships were closing in, their sleek silver forms cutting through the void like a predator homing in on its prey. They were confident, too confident. Jax could see it in the way they moved. The Threx weren't rushing. They were taking their time, believing the Terran ships were already retreating, vulnerable. He clenched his fists, the sound of the ship's engines humming steadily under his feet. It's almost too easy, he muttered. Commander Thorne stood beside him, her eyes locked on the holographic display. The Threx think they're playing the game, but they have no idea what's waiting for them. The plan was simple. Retreat just enough to lure the Threx fleet in, lead them straight to the moon. From there, the narrow gravity well would slow their ships to a crawl, leaving them trapped with nowhere to go. The only thing standing between them and success was timing. One mistake, and the Threx would break off and leave the Terrans stranded, with no chance of escape. They're about to cross the point of no return, Jax said, his voice tight. His fingers hovered over the console, waiting for the right moment to trigger the trap. His heart raced with the growing pressure. Are you sure this is going to work? Thorne turned to him with a small, knowing smile. We've trained for years to think a step ahead. If anyone can make it work, it's us. The countdown clock on the console ticked down, each second feeling like an eternity. The Threx ships were now within range of the moon, closing in on the decoy Terran fleet. Jax could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. Every instinct told him to act. Now. But he kept his hand steady, waiting for the exact moment to strike. Then it came. Now. Thorn barked, her voice sharp and commanding. Jax slammed his hand down on the console. A blast of electromagnetic energy surged from the rising dawn, creating a pulse that disrupted the Threx ship's sensors just as they entered the moon's gravitational field. The Threx commanders didn't even see it coming. Their targeting systems malfunctioned, and their ships began to lose control, forced to adjust to the unexpected interference. The first Threx ship faltered. The others followed, slowly drifting off course. As the moon's gravity gripped them, it was a perfect moment. The Threx, now disoriented, began to slow down, too slow to escape the trap. "Lock on target," Jax called, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Engage all weapons." The rising dawn's cannons roared to life, unleashing a barrage of missiles aimed at the Threx ship's vulnerable flanks. The missiles found their marks with surgical precision, detonating in a flash of light as they tore through the hulls of the Threx vessels. The rest of the Terran fleet followed suit, opening fire with everything they had. The Threx were caught in a brutal crossfire. Their ships, now trapped in the gravity well, couldn't maneuver fast enough to escape the onslaught. The Terrans weren't just fighting. They were hunting. And the Threx had wandered straight into the den. "Good work, all units," Thorn said, her tone calm, but with an edge of satisfaction. "They're not getting out of this." Jax let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His hands were shaking, but he kept his composure. The Threx fleet was in full retreat now, but it was too late. The Terrans had already done the damage they needed. The enemy ships were scattering, their formations broken, their pride shattered. One of the younger officers on the bridge grinned. "We did it. They're done." But Thorn was still focused. "Not yet. They're not out of the fight completely." Jax's eyes widened as the tactical map updated. Some of the Threx ships were still trying to make a run for it. "What do we do now?" he asked. Thorn's eyes narrowed, calculating. "Now we make sure they never get the chance to regroup." With a quiet, knowing smile, she issued the command to launch the final barrage. This time, it wasn't about strategy or traps. It was about finishing what they had started. The Terrans were no longer just surviving. They were winning, and they were going to make sure the Threx knew it. The battle had turned in the Terrans' favor, but the calm that followed was anything but peaceful. The remnants of the Threx fleet limped away from the moon, crippled but not defeated. They had lost a battle, but not the war. The survivors would return, regroup, and they would come back stronger. Everyone knew that. The rising dawn hung in the quiet aftermath of the chaos, its hull scared but intact. The occasional ping of a scanner or the soft hum of the engine was the only sound that broke the silence. Lieutenant Jax Harper stood at the observation window, staring out at the remnants of the battlefield, his mind whirling. The victory had been sweet, but the Threx weren't just another enemy to crush. They were a force, and the fight was far from over. Commander Thorn stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the drifting debris, the shattered remains of enemy ships floating like lifeless wreckage. Her face was unreadable, but Jax knew her well enough to recognize the quiet tension in her posture. She wasn't celebrating. Not yet. They were still in the midst of a war. "They'll be back," Jax said, his voice grim. "They'll come for us again. And next time, they'll be ready." Thorn didn't turn to look at him, but her response was immediate. "Of course they will. The Threx don't give up just because they've been beaten once. They're a proud species." Jax exhaled slowly, his breath fogging the glass for a moment before it dissipated. "So what do we do?" We don't have the numbers or the firepower to keep this up forever. Thorn's eyes flicked to him, the faintest glint of something in them, a spark of a thought, of something she wasn't saying. We don't fight like they do, Jax. We don't have to match their strength. Jax frowned, still not fully understanding. Then what do we do? She looked at him, finally offering him a small, knowing smile. We make them play our game. The tension in Jax's chest tightened, but he remained silent, waiting for her to explain further. She didn't disappoint. Right now, they think they're the superior force. They think they can simply crush us. But they've made a critical mistake. Thorn's voice was steady, each word carrying the weight of someone who had seen countless wars and lived through them. They're underestimating us, and they're underestimating you. Jax blinked in confusion. Me? I'm just a lieutenant. Thorn's smile widened ever so slightly. You may be a lieutenant, but you're learning faster than anyone I've seen in years. And that's exactly what we need. Someone who can think like them, but not be them. The soft hum of the ship's communication system broke the moment of quiet. A voice crackled over the speaker, pulling their attention back to the present. Commander Thorn, came the voice of Captain Pierce. We've received a distress signal from the Outer Rim. It's not from the Threx, but it's definitely related. Thorn's expression hardened. Patch it through. A few seconds later, the image of a battered human scout ship appeared on the main screen. Its hull was scorched, the ship's name barely legible. The message was short, direct, and chilling. We need immediate backup. The Threx are coming, and they're bringing everything. The image cut off abruptly, leaving only static. Jax's stomach sank. They hadn't just lost a battle. They had made the Threx angry. Very angry. Thorn stood silent for a moment, her fingers tapping lightly on the console. The tension in the room was palpable, but in her eyes, there was no sign of panic. She was already calculating the next move, already planning. We're not done here, Thorn said finally, her voice low, but filled with the resolve of someone who knew this was just another step in a much larger game. We've made our mark, but now the real fight begins. Jax took a breath. He had thought he was prepared for what was to come, but now he wasn't so sure. The Threx weren't going to let this slide. But he also knew one thing for sure: the humans weren't going to go down easily. In that moment, standing on the bridge of the rising dawn, Jax understood. The war was about to get much, much harder. But the Terrans were ready for it. The pressure in the command center was palpable. The message from the damaged scout ship had rattled everyone aboard the Rising Dawn. The Threx were coming, and they weren't coming to negotiate. They were coming to end the Terran threat once and for all. Jax Harper stood in the middle of the bridge, staring at the tactical display, which now flickered with the threat of the advancing Threx fleet. Their numbers had doubled since the last engagement, and intelligence reports indicated that they weren't holding back this time. The Terrans were outgunned and outnumbered. The balance of power had shifted, and not in their favor. We need to make a decision, Commander Thorn said, her voice cutting through the tension. She stood by the tactical console, her face etched with the seriousness of the situation. The Threx are already assembling at the edge of the system. They'll be here in less than an hour. Do we stay and fight, or do we evacuate? The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. They all knew the stakes. Leaving would mean abandoning everything they'd fought for. And the Threx would wipe out any hope of a human presence in the sector. But staying meant fighting a war they weren't sure they could win. We don't run, Thorn continued, her tone firm. We don't give them the satisfaction. Jax's heart pounded in his chest. But how do we stand a chance? Even if we pull the same tricks, they're bringing everything they've got. Thorn turned to him, her eyes sharp, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. Then we'll have to make them think we've got more than we do. We'll play their game, make them think we have reinforcements ready to drop in at any second. Jax frowned, still not entirely sure what she meant. How do we do that? We're barely holding on as it is. Thorn's lips curled into a small smile, but there was no humor in it. We make them believe they're about to face the full might of the Terran fleet. We create the illusion of strength. She strode to the command table and tapped a series of buttons. The holographic map flickered and zoomed in on several nearby uncharted moons. We'll send out decoy signals. Pretend to move a whole fleet into position. Let them think we've called for reinforcements. They'll do the rest. Jax watched as the map updated. You want them to believe we got more ships than we actually have. Exactly, Thorn replied, turning to face him. They're not going to just march in here and destroy us without considering the possibility that we've got backup waiting. If they hesitate for even a moment, we'll take that time to strike. Jax's pulse quickened. It was risky, so risky that it felt almost reckless. But he trusted Thorn. She had pulled off insane moves before, and somehow they had worked. Maybe, just maybe, it would work again. All right, Jax said, steeling himself. Let's do it. Thorn nodded. All hands to stations. We're not running. We're staying right here. The crew immediately sprang into action, their faces set with determination. There was no room for doubt now. They were going to fight, and they would make the Threx pay for underestimating them. The rising dawn slowly powered up its engines, positioning itself in a way that seemed almost like a retreat. The rest of the Terran ships in the sector followed suit, moving into place to create the illusion of a much larger fleet. The ships fired off false transponder signals, relaying fake fleet movements to the Threx. Jax watched the growing Threx fleet on the screen, knowing that every second counted. It was a delicate game of cat and mouse. The Threx would arrive expecting an easy victory, but they had no idea that they were about to walk straight into a trap. As the first Threx ship breached the outer rim, Jax clenched his fists, ready for what was to come. The humans weren't just going to survive this fight. They were going to make the Threx regret ever setting foot in this sector. Hold fast, Thorn said, her voice low but filled with resolve. We've been underestimated for too long. It's time to show them why that's a mistake. Jax nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. The Threx might have the numbers, but the humans had something they couldn't take away. Ingenuity, strategy, and the sheer will to win. The storm was coming, and the Terrans were ready. The silence of space was shattered by the hum of the rising dawn's engines as the ship and its small fleet drifted into position. The Threx had arrived, their ships filling the screen in a line that stretched across the heavens like an unrelenting wave. The Terrans' decoy signals had worked. The enemy was approaching cautiously, uncertain if the reinforcements they were expecting were real or just a trap. It was the perfect moment to strike. Commanders, they've arrived, came the voice of Lieutenant Mira, the ship's communications officer. Her tone was sharp, though the tension in the air was nearly suffocating. The Threx are holding formation, but they're waiting for something. They're not taking the bait fully yet. Commander Thorn's gaze never wavered from the holographic map. They're smarter than we thought, she muttered, half to herself. But there was no panic in her voice. She turned to Jax, who stood beside her, ready for the chaos to come. We'll need to push them harder. They're waiting for us to show weakness. Jax nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. The Terran ships were small, agile, but nowhere near as numerous as the Threx fleet. But they had one thing the Threx didn't: surprise. The Threx ships, enormous and imposing, continued to approach, their gunmetal gray hulls glinting in the distant light of the dying sun. The massive fleet moved as a single entity, calculated, ruthless. Every one of them bristled with weapons, every ship prepared to destroy, to conquer. And yet, they hesitated. They had expected a battle, but not this. Not this human ingenuity. Thorn took a steadying breath, her voice calm but commanding. Ready all weapons. On my mark. Jax's fingers hovered over the console, his eyes locked on the approaching ships. The Threx didn't realize it yet, but the rising dawn had a full load of torpedoes primed and waiting. They had one shot at this, one moment to turn the tide of the war in their favor. "Now," Thorn ordered. Jax slammed his fist into the command button, and the ship's weapons came to life with a deafening roar. The rising dawn unleashed a volley of torpedoes, cutting through the space between the two fleets like a swarm of angry bees. The Threx ships were too slow to react. The first round of torpedoes slammed into the outermost Threx vessels, tearing through their hulls with devastating precision. The ships were ripped apart, their remains scattering into space. The battle had begun. The Terran fleet surged forward, weapons blazing. Missiles and plasma bolts shot from every ship, striking the Threx fleet with deadly force. The Threx responded with equal fury, their weapons lighting up the void, but their fire was erratic. The Terrans were too fast, too unpredictable, darting around the enemy ships with impossible agility. Jax's heart raced as he fired off another series of shots. The screen in front of him flickered with incoming damage reports, but he barely noticed. His mind was locked on the enemy ships, the chaos unfolding before him. He could feel every shot, every near miss, as if it were a personal blow. This was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a fight for everything. Thorn's voice cut through the madness, sharp and focused. "Stay on course. Don't let them regroup." Jax's hand moved instinctively, guiding his ship between the gaps in the Threx fleet. He could see the cracks forming in their defenses, their once unshakable formations beginning to crumble under the relentless assault. The Threx, for all their size and firepower, were not prepared for the Terrans' unconventional tactics. Every strike, every maneuver, was designed to keep them guessing, to make them think the Terrans were everywhere at once. And then, it happened. A massive Threx flagship, its silhouette dominating the sky, erupted in a brilliant flash of light. The explosion sent shockwaves through the fleet, and for the first time, the Threx faltered. Their formation broke, the remaining ships scattered in every direction, trying to avoid the storm of fire coming at them from all sides. Jax's breath caught in his throat. "We did it." Thorn's voice was steady but filled with a hard-earned satisfaction. Not yet. The Threx fleet was in disarray, but the war was far from over. The rising dawn had won the battle, but the Threx were already plotting their next move, licking their wounds and preparing for retaliation. Jax's gaze shifted to the stars outside the window, the lights of the shattered Threx fleet blinking like dying stars. The battle had been won, but the war was still out there, waiting. But for the first time, the Terrans were no longer the underdogs. They had proven their strength, and that, Jax thought, was just the beginning.